This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 30. The Girl I Left Behind Me. We do not claim to rank among the military novelists. Our place is with the non-combatants. When the decks are cleared for action, we go below and wait meekly. We should only be in the way of the maneuvers that the gallant fellows are performing overhead. We shall go no farther with the than to the city gate, and leaving Major O'Dowd to his duty, come back to the Major's wife, and the ladies, and the baggage. Now, the Major and his lady, who had not been invited to the ball at which in our last chapter other of our friends figured, had much more time to take their wholesome natural rest in bed than was accorded to people who wished to enjoy pleasure as well as to do duty. "It's my belief, Peggy, my dear," said he, as he placidly pulled his nightcap over his ears, "that there will be such a ball danced in a day or two as some of 'em has never heard the tune of." And he was much more happy to retire to rest after partaking of a quiet tumbler than to figure at any other sort of amusement. Peggy, for her part, would have liked to have shown her turban and bird of paradise at the ball, but for the information which her husband had given her, and which made her very grave. "I'd like you to wake me about half an hour before the assembly beats," the Major said to his lady. "Call me at 1:30, Peggy dear, and see me things is ready. Maybe I'll not come back to breakfast, Mrs. O.D." With which words, which signified his opinion that the regiment would march the next morning, the Major ceased talking and fell asleep. Mrs. O'Dowd, the good housewife, arrayed in curl papers and a camisole, felt that her duty was to act and not to sleep at this juncture. "Time enough for that," she said, "when Mick's gone." And so she packed his travelling valise ready for the march, brushed his cloak, his cap, and other warlike habiliments, set them out in order for him, and stowed away in the cloak pockets a light package of portable refreshments, and a wicker-covered flask or pocket pistol, containing near a pint of a remarkably sound cognac brandy, of which she and the Major approved very much. And as soon as the hands of the repaither pointed to 1:30, and its interior arrangements (it had a tone quite equal to a cathedral, its fair owner considered) knelled forth that fatal hour, Mrs. O'Dowd woke up her Major, and had as comfortable a cup of coffee prepared for him as any maid that morning in Brussels. And who is there will deny that this worthy lady's preparations betokened affection as much as the fits of tears and hysterics by which more sensitive females exhibited their love, and that their partaking of this coffee, which they drank together while the bugles were sounding the turnout and the drums beating in the various quarters of the town, was not more useful and to the purpose than the outpouring of any mere sentiment could be. The consequence was that the Major appeared on parade quite trim, fresh, and alert, his well-shaved, rosy countenance, as he sat on horseback, giving cheerfulness and confidence to the whole corps. All the officers saluted her when the regiment marched by on the balcony on which this brave woman stood, and waved them a cheer as they passed. And I dare say it was not from want of courage, but from a sense of female delicacy and propriety, that she refrained from leading the gallant dashed personally into action. On Sundays, and at periods of a solemn nature, Mrs. O'Dowd used to read with great gravity out of a large volume of her uncle the Dean's sermons. It had been of great comfort to her on board the transport as they were coming home, and were very nearly wrecked on their return from the West Indies. After the regiment's departure, she betook herself to this volume for meditation. Perhaps she did not understand much of what she was reading, and her thoughts were elsewhere, but the sleep project, with poor Mick's nightcap up there on the pillow, was quite a vain one. So it is in the world. Jack or Donald marches away to glory with his knapsack on his shoulder, stepping out briskly to the tune of "The Girl I Left Behind Me." It is she who remains and suffers, and has the leisure to think and brood and remember. Knowing how useless regrets are, and how the indulgence of sentiment only serves to make people more miserable, Mrs. Rebecca wisely determined to give way to no vain feelings of sorrow, and bore the parting from her husband with quite a Spartan equanimity. Indeed, Captain Rawdon himself was much more affected at the leave-taking than the resolute little woman to whom he bade farewell. She had mastered this rude, coarse nature, and he loved and worshipped her with all his faculties of regard and admiration. In all his life he had never been so happy as during the past few months his wife had made him. All former delights of turf, mess, hunting field, and gambling table, all previous loves and courtships of milliners, opera dancers, and the like easy triumphs of the clumsy military Adonis, were quite insipid when compared to the lawful matrimonial pleasures which of late he had enjoyed. She had known perpetually how to divert him, and he had found his house and her society 1,000 times more pleasant than any place or company which he had ever frequented from his childhood until now. And he cursed his past follies and extravagances, and bemoaned his vast outlying debts above all, which must remain forever as obstacles to prevent his wife's advancement in the world. He had often groaned over these in midnight conversations with Rebecca, although as a bachelor they had never given him any disquiet. He himself was struck with this phenomenon. "Hang it," he would say, or perhaps use a still stronger expression out of his simple vocabulary, "before I was married I didn't care what bills I put my name to, and so long as Moses would wait or Levy would renew for 3 months, I kept on never minding. But since I'm married, except renewing, of course, I give you my honour I've not touched a bit of stamped paper." Rebecca always knew how to conjure away these moods of melancholy. "Why, my stupid love," she would say, "we have not done with your aunt yet. If she fails us, isn't there what you call the Gazette? Or stop, when your Uncle Bute's life drops, I have another scheme. The living has always belonged to the younger brother, and why shouldn't you sell out and go into the church?" The idea of this conversion sent Rawdon into roars of laughter. You might have heard the explosion through the hotel at midnight, and the haw-haws of the great dragoon's voice. General Tufto heard him from his quarters on the first floor above them. And Rebecca acted the scene with great spirit, and preached Rawdon's first sermon, to the immense delight of the General, at breakfast. But these were mere bygone days and talk. When the final news arrived that the campaign was open, and the troops were to march, Rawdon's gravity became such that Becky rallied him about it in a manner which rather hurt the feelings of the guardsmen. "You don't suppose I'm afraid, Becky, I should think," he said with a tremor in his voice. "But I'm a pretty good mark for a shot, and you see if it brings me down, why, I leave 1 and perhaps 2 behind me whom I should wish to provide for, as I brought 'em into the scrape. It is no laughing matter that, Mrs. C., anyways." Rebecca, by 100 caresses and kind words, tried to soothe the feelings of the wounded lover. It was only when her vivacity and sense of humour got the better of this sprightly creature, as they would do under most circumstances of life indeed, that she would break out with her satire, but she could soon put on a demure face. "Dearest love," she said, "do you suppose I feel nothing?" And hastily dashing something from her eyes, she looked up in her husband's face with a smile. "Look here," said he, "if I drop, let us see what there is for you. I have had a pretty good run of luck here, and here's £230. I have got 10 Napoleons in my pocket."
That is as much as I shall want, for the General pays everything like a prince, and if I'm hit, why, you know, I cost nothing. Don't cry, little woman. I may live to vex you yet. Well, I shan't take either of my horses, but shall ride the General's grey charger. It's cheaper, and I told him mine was lame. If I'm done, those two ought to fetch you something. Grigg offered 90 for the mare yesterday, before this confounded news came, and like a fool I wouldn't let her go under the 2 O's. Bullfinch will fetch his price any day, only you'd better sell him in this country, because the dealers have so many bills of mine, and so I'd rather he shouldn't go back to England. Your little mare the General gave you will fetch something, and there's no damned livery stable bills here as there are in London," Rawdon added with a laugh. "There's that dressing-case cost me 200. That is, I owe 2 for it, and the gold tops and bottles must be worth 30 or 40. Please to put that up the spout, ma'am, with my pins and rings and watch and chain and things. They cost a precious lot of money. Miss Crawley, I know, paid 100 down for the chain and ticker. Gold tops and bottles, indeed. Damme, I'm sorry I didn't take more now. Edwards pressed on me a silver gilt boot-jack, and I might have had a dressing-case fitted up with a silver warming-pan and a service of plate. But we must make the best of what we've got, Becky, you know."
And so, making his last dispositions, Captain Crawley, who had seldom thought about anything but himself until the last few months of his life, when love had obtained the mastery over the dragoon, went through the various items of his little catalogue of effects, striving to see how they might be turned into money for his wife's benefit, in case any accident should befall him. He pleased himself by noting down with a pencil, in his big schoolboy handwriting, the various items of his portable property which might be sold for his widow's advantage, as, for example, "My double barrel by Manton, say 40 guineas. My driving cloak, lined with sable fur, 50 pounds. My duelling pistols in rosewood case, same which I shot Captain Marker, 20 pounds. My regulation saddle holsters and housings, my lorry ditto," and so forth, over all of which articles he made Rebecca the mistress. Faithful to his plan of economy, the captain dressed himself in his oldest and shabbiest uniform and epaulettes, leaving the newest behind, under his wife's, or it might be his widow's, guardianship. And this famous dandy of Windsor and Hyde Park went off onto his campaign with a kit as modest as that of a sergeant, and with something like a prayer on his lips for the woman he was leaving. He took her up from the ground and held her in his arms for a minute, tight pressed against his strong beating heart. His face was purple and his eyes dim as he put her down and left her. He rode by his general's side and smoked his cigar in silence as they hastened after the troops of the general's brigade, which preceded them. And it was not until they were some miles on their way that he left off twirling his moustache and broke silence. And Rebecca, as we have said, wisely determined not to give way to unavailing sentimentality on her husband's departure. She waved him an adieu from the window, and stood there for a moment looking out after he was gone. The cathedral towers and the full gables of the quaint old houses were just beginning to blush in the sunrise. There had been no rest for her that night. She was still in her pretty ball dress, her fair hair hanging somewhat out of curl on her neck, and the circles round her eyes dark with watching. "What a fright I seem," she said, examining herself in the glass, "and how pale this pink makes one look." So she divested herself of this pink raiment, in doing which a note fell out from her corsage, which she picked up with a smile and locked into her dressing-box. And then she put her bouquet of the ball into a glass of water, and went to bed, and slept very comfortably. The town was quite quiet when she woke up at 10 o'clock and partook of coffee, very requisite and comforting after the exhaustion and grief of the morning's occurrences. This meal over, she resumed honest Rawdon's calculations of the night previous, and surveyed her position. Should the worst befall, all things considered, she was pretty well to do. There were her own trinkets and trousseau, in addition to those which her husband had left behind. Rawdon's generosity, when they were first married, has already been described and lauded. Besides these, and the little mare, the General, her slave and worshipper, had made her many very handsome presents, in the shape of cashmere shawls bought at the auction of a bankrupt French general's lady, and numerous tributes from the jewellers' shops, all of which betokened her admirers' taste and wealth. As for tickers, as poor Rawdon called watches, her apartments were alive with their clicking. For happening to mention one night that hers, which Rawdon had given to her, was of English workmanship, and went ill, on the very next morning there came to her a little bijou marked Leroy, with a chain and cover charmingly set with turquoises, and another signed Briquette, which was covered with pearls, and yet scarcely bigger than a half-crown. General Tufto had bought one, and Captain Osborne had gallantly presented the other. Mrs. Osborne had no watch, though, to do George justice, she might have had one for the asking, and the Honourable Mrs. Tufto in England had an old instrument of her mother's that might have served for the plate-warming pan which Rawdon talked about. If Messrs. Howell and James were to publish a list of the purchasers of all of the trinkets they sell, how surprised would some families be! And if all these ornaments went to gentlemen's lawful wives and daughters, what a profusion of jewelry there would be exhibited in the genteelest homes of Vanity Fair! Every calculation made of these valuables Mrs. Rebecca found, not without a pungent feeling of triumph and self-satisfaction, that should circumstances occur, she might reckon on 600 or 700 pounds at the very least, to begin the world with. And she passed the morning disposing, ordering, looking out, and locking up her properties in the most agreeable manner. Among the notes in Rawdon's pocket-book was a draft for 20 pounds on Osborne's banker. This made her think about Mrs. Osborne. "I will go and get the draft cashed," she said, "and pay a visit afterwards to poor little Emmy." If this is a novel without a hero, at least let us lay claim to a heroine. No man in the British army which has marched away, not the great Duke himself, could be more cool and collected in the presence of doubts and difficulties than the indomitable little aide-de-camp's wife. And there was another of our acquaintances who was also to be left behind, a non-combatant, and whose emotions and behavior we have therefore a right to know. This was our friend the ex-collector of Bogley Wollah, whose rest was broken, like other people's, by the sounding of the bugles in the early morning. Being a great sleeper and fond of his bed, it is possible he would have snoozed on until his usual hour of rising in the forenoon, in spite of all the drums, bugles, and bagpipes in the British army, but for an interruption, which did not come from George Osborne, who shared Joss's quarters with him, and was as usual occupied too much with his own affairs or with grief at parting with his wife to think of taking leave of his slumbering brother-in-law. It was not George, we say, who interposed between Joss Sedley and sleep, but Captain Dobbin, who came and roused him up, insisting on shaking hands with him before his departure. "Very kind of you," said Joss, yawning, and wishing the captain at the deuce. I didn't like to go off without saying good-bye, you know," Dobbin said in a very incoherent manner, "because, you know, some of us mayn't come back again, and I like to see you all well, and that sort of thing, you know." "What do you mean?" Joss asked, rubbing his eyes. The captain did not in the least hear him, or look at the stout gentleman in the nightcap, about whom he professed to have such a tender interest. The hypocrite was looking and listening with all his might in the direction of George's apartments, striding about the room, upsetting the chairs, beating the tattoo, biting his nails, and showing other signs of great inward emotion. Joss had always had rather a mean opinion of the captain,
and now began to think his courage was somewhat equivocal. "What is it I can do for you, Dobbin?" he said in a sarcastic tone. "I'll tell you what you can do," the captain replied, coming up to the bed. "We march in 1/4 of an hour, Sedley, and neither George nor I may ever come back. Mind you, you are not to stir from this town until you ascertain how things go. You are to stay here and watch over your sister, and comfort her, and see that no harm comes to her. If anything happens to George, remember she has no one but you in the world to look to. If it goes wrong with the army, you'll see her safe back to England, and you will promise me on your word that you will never desert her. I know that you won't. As far as money goes, you are always free enough with that. Do you want any? I mean, have you enough gold to take you back to England in case of a misfortune?" "Sir," said Jos majestically, "when I want money, I know where to ask for it. And as for my sister, you needn't tell me how I ought to behave to her." "You speak like a man of spirit, Jos," the other answered good-naturedly, "and I am glad that George can leave her in such good hands. So I may give him your word of honor, may I, that in case of extremity you will stand by her?" "Of course, of course," answered Mr. Jos, whose generosity in money matters Dobbin estimated quite correctly. "And you'll see her safe out of Brussels in the event of a defeat?" "A defeat? Dash it, sir, it's impossible. Don't try to frighten me," the hero cried from his bed. And Dobbin's mind was thus perfectly set at ease, now that Jos had spoken out so resolutely respecting his conduct to his sister. "At least," thought the captain, "there will be a retreat secured for her in case the worst should ensue." If Captain Dobbin expected to get any personal comfort and satisfaction from having one more view of Amelia before the regiment marched away, his selfishness was punished just as such odious egotism deserved to be. The door of Jos's bedroom opened into the sitting-room which was common to the family party, and opposite this door was that of Amelia's chamber. The bugles had wakened everybody. There was no use in concealment now. George's servant was packing in this room, Osborne coming in and out of the contiguous bedroom, flinging to the man such articles as he thought fit to carry on this campaign. And presently Dobbin had the opportunity which his heart coveted, and he got sight of Amelia's face once more. But what a face it was! So white, so wild and despair-stricken, that the remembrance of it haunted him afterwards like a crime, and the sight smote him with inexpressible pangs of longing and pity. She was wrapped in a white mourning dress, her hair falling on her shoulders, and her large eyes fixed and without light. By way of helping on the preparations for the departure, and showing that she too could be useful at a moment so critical, this poor soul had taken up a sash of George's from the drawers whereon it lay, and followed him to and fro with the sash in her hand, looking on mutely as his packing proceeded. She came out and stood, leaning at the wall, holding this sash against her bosom, from which the heavy net of crimson dropped like a large stain of blood. Our gentle-hearted captain felt a guilty shock as he looked at her. "Good God!" thought he, "and is it grief like this I dared to pry into?" And there was no help, no means to soothe and comfort this helpless, speechless misery. He stood for a moment and looked at her, powerless and torn with pity, as a parent regards an infant in pain. At last George took Emmie's hand and led her back into the bedroom, from whence he came out alone. The parting had taken place in that moment, and he was gone. "Thank heaven that is over," George thought, bounding down the stair, his sword under his arm, as he ran swiftly to the alarm ground where the regiment was mustered, and whither trooped men and officers hurrying from their billets. His pulse was throbbing and his cheeks flushed. The great game of war was going to be played, and he one of the players. What a fierce excitement of doubt, hope, and pleasure! What tremendous hazards of loss or gain!
What were all the games of chance he had ever played compared to this one? Into all contests requiring athletic skill and courage, the young man, from his boyhood upwards, had flung himself with all his might. The champion of his school and his regiment, the bravos of his companions had followed him everywhere. From the boys' cricket match to the garrison races, he had won 100 of triumphs, and wherever he went, women and men had admired and envied him. What qualities are there for which a man gets so speedy a return of applause as those of bodily superiority, activity, and valor? Time out of mind, strength and courage have been the theme of bards and romances, and from the story of Troy down to today, poetry has always chosen a soldier for a hero. I wonder, is it because men are cowards at heart that they admire bravery so much, and place military valor so far beyond every other quality for reward and worship? So, at the sound of that stirring call to battle, George jumped away from the gentle arms in which he had been dallying, not without a feeling of shame, although his wife's hold on him had been but feeble, that he should have been detained there so long. The same feeling of eagerness and excitement was amongst all those friends of his of whom we have had occasional glimpses, from the stout senior major, who led the regiment into action, to little Stubble, the ensign, who was to bear its colors on that day. The sun was just rising as the march began. It was a gallant sight. The band led the column, playing the regimental march. Then came the major in command, riding upon Pyramus, his stout charger. Then marched the grenadiers, their captain at their head. In the center were the colors, borne by the senior and junior ensigns. Then George came marching at the head of his company. He looked up and smiled at Amelia, and passed on. And even the sound of the music died away. End of chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Recorded July 16th, 2006, in Kettering, Ohio, USA. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 31, in which Jos Sedley takes care of his sister. Thus, all the superior officers being summoned on duty elsewhere, Jos Sedley was left in command of the little colony at Brussels, with Amelia invalided, Isidore, his Belgian servant, and the bonne, who was maid of all work for the establishment, as a garrison under him. Though he was disturbed in spirit, and his rest destroyed by Dobbin's interruption and the occurrences of the morning, Jos nevertheless remained for many hours in bed, wakeful and rolling about there, until his usual hour of rising had arrived. The sun was high in the heavens, and our gallant friends of the dashed miles on their march, before the civilian appeared in his flowered dressing-gown at breakfast. About George's absence, his brother-in-law was very easy in mind. Perhaps Jos was rather pleased in his heart that Osborne was gone, for during George's presence the other had played but a very secondary part in the household, and Osborne did not scruple to show his contempt for the stout civilian. But Emmy had always been good and attentive to him. It was she who ministered to his comforts, who superintended the dishes that he liked, who walked or rode with him, as she had many, too many opportunities of doing, for where was George? And who interposed her sweet face between his anger and her husband's scorn. Many timid remonstrances had she uttered to George in behalf of her brother, but the former, in his trenchant way, cut these entreaties short. "I'm an honest man," he said, "and if I have a feeling I show it, as an honest man will. How the deuce, my dear, would you have me behave respectfully to such a fool as your brother?" So Jos was pleased with George's absence. His plain hat and gloves on a sideboard, and the idea that the owner was away, caused Jos I don't know what secret thrill of pleasure.
He won't be troubling me this morning, Joss thought, with his dandified airs and his impudence. "Put the captain's hat into the anteroom," he said to Isidore, the servant.
"Perhaps he won't want it again," replied the lackey, looking knowingly at his master. He hated George, too, whose insolence towards him was quite of the English sort.
"And ask if Madame is coming to breakfast," Mr. Sedley said with great majesty, ashamed to enter with a servant upon the subject of his dislike for George. The truth is, he had abused his brother to the valet a score of times before. Alas, Madame could not come to breakfast and cut the tartines that Mr. Joss liked. Madame was a great deal too ill, and had been in a frightful state ever since her husband's departure, so her bonne said. Joss showed his sympathy by pouring her out a large cup of tea. It was his way of exhibiting kindness, and he improved on this. He not only sent her breakfast, but he bethought him what delicacies she would most like for dinner. Isidore, the valet, had looked on very sulkily while Osborne's servant was disposing of his master's baggage previous to the captain's departure. For, in the first place, he hated Mr. Osborne, whose conduct to him and to all inferiors was generally overbearing. Nor does the continental domestic like to be treated with insolence, as our own better-tempered servants do. And secondly, he was angry that so many valuables should be removed from under his hands, to fall into other people's possession when the English discomfiture should arrive. Of this defeat he, and a vast number of other persons in Brussels and Belgium, did not make the slightest doubt. The almost universal belief was that the Emperor would divide the Prussian and English armies, annihilate one after the other, and march into Brussels before 3 days were over, when all the movables of his present masters, who would be killed, or fugitives, or prisoners, would lawfully become the property of Monsieur Isidore. As he helped Joss through his toilsome and complicated daily toilette, the faithful servant would calculate what he should do with the very articles with which he was decorating his master's person. He would make a present of the silver essence bottles and toilet knickknacks to a young lady of whom he was fond, and keep the English cutlery and the large ruby pin for himself. It would look very smart upon one of the fine frilled shirt, which, with the gold lace cap and the frogged frock coat, might easily be cut down to suit his shape. And the captain's gold-headed cane, and the great double ring with the rubies, which he would have made into a pair of beautiful earrings, he calculated would make a perfect Adonis of himself, and render Mademoiselle Reine an easy prey. "How those sleeve buttons will suit me," thought he, as he fixed a pair on the fat pudgy wrists of Mr. Sedley. "I long for sleeve buttons, and the captain's boots with brass spurs in the next room. Corbleu! What an effect they will make in the Allée Verte!" So, while Monsieur Isidore with bodily fingers was holding on to his master's nose and shaving the lower part of Joss's face, his imagination was rambling along the green avenue, dressed out in a frogged coat and lace, and in company with Mademoiselle Reine. He was loitering in spirit on the banks, and examining the barges sailing slowly under the cool shadows of the trees by the canal, or refreshing himself with a mug of faro at the bench of a beer-house on the road to Laeken. But Mr. Joseph Sedley, luckily for his own peace, no more knew what was passing in his domestic's mind than the respected reader, and I suspect what John or Mary, whose wages we pay, think of ourselves. What our servants think of us! Did we know what our intimates and dear relations thought of us, we should live in a world that we should be glad to quit, and in a frame of mind and a constant terror that would be perfectly unbearable. So Joss's man was marking his victim down, as you see one of Mr. Painter's assistants in Leadenhall Street ornament an unconscious turtle with a placard on which is written, "Soup tomorrow." Amelia's attendant was much less selfishly disposed. Few dependents could come near that kind and gentle creature
without paying their usual tribute of loyalty and affection to her sweet and affectionate nature. And it is a fact that Pauline the cook consoled her mistress more than anybody whom she saw on this wretched morning, for when she found how Amelia remained for hours, silent, motionless, and haggard, by the windows in which she had placed herself to watch the last bayonets of the column as it marched away, the honest girl took the lady's hand and said, "Tenez, madame, est-ce qu'il n'est pas aussi alarmé, mon homme à moi?" with which she burst into tears, and Amelia, falling into her arms, did likewise, and so each pitied and soothed the other. Several times during the forenoon Mr. Joss's Isidore went from his lodgings into the town, and to the gates of the hotels and lodging-houses round about the park, where the English were congregated, and there mingled with the other valets, couriers, and lackeys, gathered such news as was abroad, and brought back bulletins for his master's information. Almost all these gentlemen were in heart partisans of the emperor, and had their opinions about the speedy end of the campaign. The emperor's proclamation from Avesnes had been distributed everywhere plentifully in Brussels. "Soldiers," it said, "this is the anniversary of Marengo and Friedland, by which the destinies of Europe were twice decided. Then, as after Austerlitz, as after Wagram, we were too generous. We believed in the oaths and promises of princes, whom we suffered to remain upon their thrones. Let us march once more to meet them. We and they, are we not still the same men? Soldiers! These same Prussians who are so arrogant today were 3-1 against you at Jena, and 6-1 at Montmirail. Those among you who were prisoners in England can tell their comrades what frightful torments they suffered on board the English hulks. Madmen! A moment of prosperity has blinded them, and if they enter into France, it will be to find a grave there." But the partisans of the French prophesied a more speedy extermination of the emperor's enemies than this, and it was agreed on all hands that the Prussians and British would never return, except as prisoners in the rear of the conquering army. These opinions, in the course of the day, were brought to operate upon Mr. Sedley. He was told that the Duke of Wellington had gone to try and rally his army, the advance of which had been utterly crushed the night before. "Crushed! Pshaw!" said Joss, whose heart was pretty stout at breakfast-time. "The Duke has gone to beat the Emperor, as he has beaten all his generals before." "His papers are burned, his effects are removed, and his quarters are being got ready for the Duke of Dalmatia," Joss's informant replied. "I had it from his own Machade hotel. Milord Duc de Richemont's people are packing up everything. His Grace has fled already, and the Duchess is only waiting to see the plate packed to join the King of France at Ostend." "The King of France is at Ghent, fellow," replied Joss, affecting incredulity. "He fled last night to Bruges, and embarks today from Ostend. The Duc de Berry is taken prisoner. Those who wish to be safe had better go soon, for the dikes will be opened tomorrow, and who can fly when the whole country is under water?" "Nonsense, sir! We are 3-1, sir, against any force Boney can bring into the field," Mr. Sedley objected. "The Austrians and Russians are on their march. He shall be crushed," Joss said, slapping his hand on the table. "The Prussians were 3-1 at Jena, and he took their army and kingdom in a week. They were 6-1 at Montmirail, and he scattered them like sheep. The Austrian army is coming, but with the Empress and the King of Rome at its head. And the Russians? Bah! The Russians will withdraw. No quarter is to be given to the English, on account of their cruelty to our braves on board the infamous pontoons. Look here! Here it is, in black and white. Here's the proclamation of His Majesty the Emperor and King," said the now declared partisan of Napoleon, and taking the document from his pocket, Isidore sternly thrust it into his master's face, and already looked upon the frogged coat and valuables as his own spoil. Joss was, if not seriously alarmed as yet, at least considerably disturbed in mind. "Give me my coat and cap, sir," said he, "and follow me.
I will go myself and learn the truth of these reports." Isidore was furious as Jos put on the braided frock. "Milor had better not wear that military coat," said he. "The Frenchmen have sworn not to give quarter to a single British soldier." "Silence, sirrah!" said Jos, with a resolute countenance still, and thrust his arm into the sleeve with indomitable resolution. In the performance of which heroic act he was found by Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, who at this juncture came up to visit Amelia, and entered without ringing at the antechamber door. Rebecca was dressed very neatly and smartly, as usual. Her quiet sleep after Rawdon's departure had refreshed her, and her pink smiling cheeks were quite pleasant to look at, in a town and on a day when everybody else's countenance wore the appearance of the deepest anxiety and gloom. She laughed at the attitude in which Jos was discovered, and the struggles and convulsions with which the stout gentleman thrust himself into the braided coat. "Are you preparing to join the army, Mr. Joseph?" she said. "Is there to be nobody left in Brussels to protect us poor women?" Jos succeeded in plunging into the coat, and came forward blushing and stuttering out excuses to his fair visitor. "How was she after the events of the morning? After the fatigues of the ball the night before?" Monsieur Isidore disappeared into his master's adjacent bedroom, bearing off the flowered dressing-gown. "How good of you to ask," said she, pressing one of his hands in both her own. "How cool and collected you look when everybody else is frightened. How is our dear little Emmy? It must have been an awful, awful parting." "Tremendous," Jos said. "You men can bear anything," replied the lady. "Parting or danger are nothing to you. Oh, now that you were going to join the army and leave us to our fate. I know you were. Something tells me you were. I was so frightened when the thought came into my head, for I do sometimes think of you when I am alone, Mr. Joseph, that I ran off immediately to beg and entreat you not to fly from us." This speech might be interpreted, "My dear sir, should an accident befall the army, and a retreat be necessary, you have a very comfortable carriage, in which I propose to take a seat." I don't know whether Jos understood the words in this sense, but he was profoundly mortified by the lady's inattention to him during their stay at Brussels. He had never been presented to any of Rawdon Crawley's great acquaintances. He had scarcely been invited to Rebecca's parties, for he was too timid to play much, and his presence bored George and Rawdon equally, who neither of them, perhaps, liked to have a witness of the amusements in which the pair chose to indulge. "Ah," thought Jos, "now she wants me, she comes to me. When there is nobody else in the way, she can think about old Joseph Sedley." But besides these doubts, he felt flattered at the idea Rebecca expressed of his courage. He blushed a good deal, and put on an air of importance. "I should like to see the action," he said. "Every man of any spirit would, you know. I've seen a little service in India, but nothing on this grand scale." "You men would sacrifice anything for a pleasure," Rebecca answered. "Captain Crawley left me this morning as gay as if he were going to a hunting party. What does he care? What do any of you care for the agonies and tortures of a poor forsaken woman? I wonder whether he could really have been going to the troops, this great lazy gourmand. Oh, dear Mr. Sedley, I have come to you for comfort, for consolation. I have been on my knees all the morning. I tremble at the frightful danger into which our husbands, our friends, our brave troops and allies are rushing, and I come here for shelter, and find another of my friends, the last remaining to me, bent upon plunging into the dreadful scene." "My dear madam," Jos replied, now beginning to be quite soothed, "don't be alarmed. I only said I should like to go. What Briton would not? But my duty keeps me here. I can't leave that poor creature in the next room."
and he pointed with his finger to the door of the chamber in which Amelia was. "Good, noble brother," Rebecca said, putting her handkerchief to her eyes, and smelling the eau de cologne with which it was scented. "I have done you injustice. You have got a heart. I thought you had not." "Oh, upon my honor," Jos said, making a motion as if he would lay his hand upon the spot in question, "you do me injustice. Indeed you do, my dear Mrs. Crawley." "I do, now your heart is true to your sister. But I remember 2 years ago, when it was false to me," Rebecca said, fixing her eyes upon him for an instant, and then turning away into the window. Jos blushed violently. That organ, which he was accused by Rebecca of not possessing, began to thump tumultuously. He recalled the days when he had fled from her, and the passions which had once inflamed him. The days when he had driven her in his curricle, when she had knit the green purse for him, when he had sat enraptured, gazing at her white arms and bright eyes. "I know you think me ungrateful," Rebecca continued, coming out of the window, and once more looking at him and addressing him in a low, tremulous voice. "Your coldness, your averted looks, your manner when we have met of late, when I came in just now, all proved it to me. But were there no reasons why I should avoid you? Let your own heart answer that question. Do you think my husband was too much inclined to welcome you? The only unkind words I have ever had from him, I will do Captain Crawley that justice, have been about you, and most cruel, cruel words they were." "Good gracious, what have I done?" asked Jos in a flurry of pleasure and perplexity. "What have I done to... "Is jealousy nothing?" said Rebecca. "He makes me miserable about you, and whatever it might have been once, my heart is all his. I am innocent now, am I not, Mr. Sedley?" All Jos's blood tingled with delight as he surveyed this victim to his attractions. A few adroit words, 1 or 2 knowing, tender glances of the eyes, and his heart was inflamed again, and his doubts and suspicions forgotten. From Solomon downwards, have not wiser men than he been cajoled and befooled by women? "If the worst comes to the worst," Becky thought, "my retreat is secure, and I have a right-hand seat in the barouche." There is no knowing into what declarations of love and ardor the tumultuous passions of Mr. Joseph might have led him, if Isidore the valet had not made his reappearance at this minute, and begun to busy himself about the domestic affairs. Jos, who was just going to gasp out an avowal, choked almost with the emotion that he was obliged to restrain. Rebecca, too, bethought her that it was time she should go and comfort her dearest Amelia. "Au revoir," she said, kissing her hand to Mr. Joseph, and tapped gently at the door of his sister's apartment. As she entered and closed the door on herself, he sank down in a chair, and gazed and sighed and puffed portentously. "That coat is very tight for milor," Isidore said, still having his eye on the frogs. But his master heard him not. His thoughts were elsewhere, now glowing, maddening, upon the contemplation of the enchanting Rebecca, anon shrinking guiltily before the vision of the jealous Rawdon Crawley, with his curling fierce mustachios, and his terrible dueling pistols loaded and cocked. Rebecca's appearance struck Amelia with terror, and made her shrink back. It recalled her to the world and the remembrance of yesterday. In the overpowering fears about tomorrow, she had forgotten Rebecca, jealousy, everything, except that her husband was gone and was in danger, until this dauntless worldling came in and broke the spell and lifted the latch, We too have forborne to enter into that sad chamber. How long had that poor girl been on her knees? What hours of speechless prayer and bitter prostration had she passed there? The war chroniclers who write brilliant stories of fight and triumph scarcely tell us of these. These are too mean parts of the pageant, and you don't hear widows' cries or mothers' sobs in the midst of the shouts and jubilation in the great chorus of victory. And yet, when was the time that such have not cried out, heartbroken, humble protestants, unheard in the uproar of the triumph? After the first movement of terror in Amelia's mind, when Rebecca's green eyes lighted upon her, and rustling in her fresh silks and brilliant ornaments, the latter tripped up with extended arms to embrace her, a feeling of anger succeeded, and from being deadly pale before, her face flushed up red, and she returned Rebecca's look after a moment with a steadiness that surprised and somewhat abashed her rival. "Dearest Amelia, you are very unwell," the visitor said, putting forth her hand to take Amelia's. "What is it? I could not rest until I knew how you were." Amelia drew back her hand. Never since her life began had that gentle soul refused to believe or to answer any demonstration of goodwill or affection. But she drew back her hand and trembled all over. "Why are you here, Rebecca?" she said, still looking at her solemnly with her large eyes. These glances troubled her visitor. "She must have seen him give me the letter at the ball," Rebecca thought. "Don't be agitated, dear Amelia," she said, looking down. "I came but to see if you were well." "Are you well?" said Amelia. "I dare say you are. You don't love your husband. You would not be here if you did. Tell me, Rebecca, did I ever do you anything but kindness?" "Indeed, Amelia, no," the other said, still hanging down her head. "When you were quite poor, who was it that befriended you? Was I not a sister to you? You saw us all in happier days before he married me. I was all in all then to him. Or would he have given up his fortune, his family, as he nobly did, to make me happy? Why did you come between my love and me? Who sent you to separate those whom God joined, and take my darling's heart from me, my own husband? Do you think you could love him as I did? His love was everything to me. You knew it, and wanted to rob me of it. For shame, Rebecca! Bad and wicked woman! False friend and false wife!" "Amelia, I protest before God I have done my husband no wrong," Rebecca said, turning from her. "Have you done me no wrong, Rebecca? You did not succeed, but you tried. Ask your heart if you did not." She knows nothing, Rebecca thought. "He came back to me. I knew he would. I knew that no falsehood, no flattery could keep him from me long. I knew he would come. I prayed so that he should." The poor girl spoke these words with a spirit and volubility which Rebecca had never before seen in her, and before which the latter was quite dumb. "But what have I done to you," she continued in a more pitiful tone, "that you should try and take him from me? I had him but for 6 weeks. You might have spared me those, Rebecca. And yet, from the very first day of our wedding, you came and blighted it. Now he is gone. Are you come to see how unhappy I am?" she continued. "You made me wretched enough for the past fortnight. You might have spared me today." I never came here," interposed Rebecca, with unlucky truth. "No, you didn't come. You took him away. Are you come to fetch him from me?" she continued in a wilder tone. "He was here, but he is gone now. There on that very sofa he sat. Don't touch it. We sat and talked there. I was on his knee, and my arms were round his neck, and we said, 'Our Father.' Yes, he was here, and they came and took him away, but he promised me to come back."
"He will come back, my dear," said Rebecca, touched in spite of herself.
"Look," said Amelia, "this is his sash. Isn't it a pretty color?"
And she took up the fringe and kissed it. She had tied it round her waist at some part of the day. She had forgotten her anger, her jealousy, the very presence of her rival, seemingly, for she walked silently and almost with a smile on her face towards the bed, and began to smooth down George's pillow. Rebecca walked too, silently, away. "How is Amelia?" asked Jos, who still held his position in the chair. "There should be somebody with her," said Rebecca. "I think she is very unwell." And she went away with a very grave face, refusing Mr. Sedley's entreaties that she would stay and partake of the early dinner which he had ordered. Rebecca was of a good-natured and obliging disposition, and she liked Amelia rather than otherwise. Even her hard words, reproachful as they were complimentary, the groans of a person stinging under defeat. Meeting Mrs. O'Dowd, whom the Dean's sermons had by no means comforted, and who was walking very disconsolately in the park, Rebecca accosted the latter, rather to the surprise of the Major's wife, who was not accustomed to such marks of politeness from Mrs. Rod and Crawley, and informing her that poor little Mrs. Osborne was in a desperate condition, and almost mad with grief, sent off the good-natured Irishwoman straight to see if she could console her young favourite.
"I've cares of my own enough," Mrs. O'Dowd said gravely, "and I thought poor Amelia would be little wanting for company this day. But if she's so bad as you say, and you can't attend to her, who used to be so fond of her, faith, I'll see if I can be of service. And so, good marning to you, madam." With which speech, and a toss of her head, the lady of the Repeater took a farewell of Mrs. Crawley, whose company she by no means courted. Becky watched her marching off, with a smile on her lip. She had the keenest sense of humour, and the Parthian look which the retreating Mrs. O'Dowd flung over her shoulder almost upset Mrs. Crawley's gravity. "My service to ye, me fine madam, and I'm glad to see ye so cheerful," thought Peggy. "It's not you that will cry your eyes out with grief, anyway." And with this she passed on, and speedily found her way to Mrs. Osborne's lodgings. The poor soul was still at the bedside where Rebecca had left her, and stood almost crazy with grief. The Major's wife, a stronger-minded woman, endeavoured her best to comfort her young friend. "You must bear up, Amelia dear," she said kindly, "for he mustn't find you ill when he sends for you after the victory. It's not you are the only woman that are in the hands of God this day." "I know that. I am very wicked, very weak," Amelia said. She knew her own weakness well enough. The presence of her more resolute friend checked it, however, and she was the better of this control and company. They went on till 2 o'clock. Their hearts were with the column as it marched farther and farther away. Dreadful doubt and anguish, prayers and fears and griefs unspeakable, followed the regiment. It was the women's tribute to the war. It taxes both alike, and takes the blood of the men and the tears of the women. At 2:30 an event occurred of daily importance to Mr. Joseph. The dinner hour arrived. Warriors may fight and perish, but he must dine. He came into Amelia's room to see if he could coax her to share that meal. "Try," said he. "The soup is very good. Do try, Emmy." And he kissed her hand. Except when she was married, he had not done so much for years before. "You are very good and kind, Joseph," she said. Everybody is. But, if you please, I will stay in my room today." The savour of the soup, however, was agreeable to Mrs. O'Dowd's nostrils, and she thought she would bear Mr. Joss company. So the two sat down to their meal. "God bless the meat," said the Major's wife solemnly. She was thinking of her honest Mick, riding at the head of his regiment. "'Tis but a bad dinner those poor boys will get today," she said with a sigh, and then, like a philosopher, fell to. Joss's spirits rose with his meal. He would drink the regiment's health, or indeed take any other excuse to indulge in a glass of champagne. "We'll drink to O'Dowd and the brave Dasht," said he, bowing gallantly to his guest. "Hey, Mrs. O'Dowd? Fill Mrs. O'Dowd's glass, Isidore." But all of a sudden Isidore started, and the Major's wife laid down her knife and fork. The windows of the room were open and looked southward, and a dull, distant sound came over the sun-lighted roofs from that direction. "What is it?" said Joss. "Why don't you pour, you rascal?" "C'est le feu," said Isidore, running to the balcony. "God defend us, it's cannon!" Mrs. O'Dowd cried, starting up, and followed too to the window. 1,000 pale and anxious faces might have been seen looking from other casements, and presently it seemed as if the whole population of the city rushed into the streets. End of chapter 31.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maureen O'Brien. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 32, in which Joss takes flight and the war is brought to a close. We of peaceful London City have never beheld, and please God never shall witness, such a scene of hurry and alarm as that which Brussels presented. Crowds rushed to the Namur gate, from which direction the noise proceeded, and many rode along the level chaussee to be in advance of any intelligence from the army. Each man asked his neighbour for news, and even great English lords and ladies condescended to speak to persons whom they did not know. The friends of the French went abroad, wild with excitement, and prophesying the triumph of their emperor. The merchants closed their shops, and came out to swell the general chorus of alarm and clamour. Women rushed to the churches, and crowded the chapels, and knelt and prayed on the flags and steps. The dull sound of the cannon went on rolling, rolling. Presently carriages with travellers began to leave the town, galloping away by the Ghent barrier. The prophecies of the French partisans began to pass for facts. "He has cut the armies in two," it was said. "He is marching straight on Brussels. He will overpower the English and be here tonight." "He will overpower the English!" shrieked Isidore to his master, "and will be here tonight!" The man bounded in and out from the lodgings to the street, always returning with some fresh particulars of disaster. Joss's face grew paler and paler. Alarm began to take entire possession of the stout civilian. All the champagne he drank brought no courage to him. Before sunset he was worked up to such a pitch of nervousness as gratified his friend Isidore to behold, who now counted surely upon the spoils of the owner of the laced coat. The women were away all this time. After hearing the firing for a moment, the stout major's wife bethought her of her friend in the next chamber, and ran in to watch, and, if possible, to console Amelia. The idea that she had that helpless and gentle creature to protect gave additional strength to the natural courage of the honest Irishwoman. She passed 5 hours by her friend's side, sometimes in remonstrance, sometimes talking cheerfully, oftener in silence and terrified mental supplication.
"I never let go her hand once," said the stout lady afterwards, "until after sunset, when the firing was over."
Pauline, the bonne, was on her knees at the church hard by, praying for son homme à elle. When the noise of the cannonading was over, Mrs. O'Dowd issued out of Amelia's room into the parlor adjoining, where Jos sat with 2 emptied flasks and courage entirely gone. Once or twice he had ventured into his sister's bedroom, looking very much alarmed, and as if he would say something. But the Major's wife kept her place, and he went away without disburthening himself of his speech. He was ashamed to tell her that he wanted to fly. But when she made her appearance in the dining-room, where he sat in the twilight in the cheerless company of his empty champagne bottles, he began to open his mind to her.
"Mrs. O'Dowd," he said, "hadn't you better get Amelia ready?"
"Are you going to take her out for a walk?" said the Major's lady.
"Sure, she's too weak to stir." I've ordered the carriage," he said, and post-horses. Isidore has gone for them," Jos continued.
"What do you want with driving tonight?" answered the lady.
"Isn't she better on her bed? I've just got her to lie down." "Get her up," said Jos. "She must get up, I say." And he stamped his foot energetically. "I say the horses are ordered. Yes, the horses are ordered. It's all over, and—"
"And what?" asked Mrs. O'Dowd.
"I'm off to Ghent," Jos answered. "Everybody is going. There's a place for you. We shall start in half an hour."
The Major's wife looked at him with infinite scorn.
"I don't move till O'Dowd gives me the route," said she. "You may go if you like, Mr. Sedley, but faith, Amelia and I stop here."
"She shall go,"
said Jos, with another stamp of his foot. Mrs. O'Dowd put herself with arms akimbo before the bedroom door.
"Is it her mother you're going to take her to?" she said. "Or do you want to go to Mamma yourself, Mr. Sedley? Good marnin'. A pleasant journey to you, sir. Bon voyage, as they say. And take my counsel, and shave off them mustachios, or they'll bring you into mischief."
"Tea! Dash in!"
yelled out Jos, wild with fear, rage, and mortification. And Isidore came in at this juncture, swearing in his turn.
"Pas de chevaux! Sacre bleu!"
hissed out the furious domestic. All the horses were gone. Jos was not the only man in Brussels seized with panic that day. But Jos's fears, great and cruel as they were already, were destined to increase to an almost frantic pitch before the night was over. It has been mentioned how Pauline de Bonne had son homme à elle also in the ranks of the army that had gone out to meet the Emperor Napoleon. This lover was a native of Brussels, and a Belgian hussar. The troops of his nation signalized themselves in this war for anything but courage, and young Van Cutsum, Pauline's admirer, was too good a soldier to disobey his colonel's orders to run away. Whilst in garrison at Brussels, young Regulus (he had been born in the revolutionary times) found his great comfort, and passed almost all his leisure moments, in Pauline's kitchen. And it was with pockets and holsters crammed full of good things from her larder that he had taken leave of his weeping sweetheart, to proceed upon the campaign a few days before. As far as his regiment was concerned, this campaign was over now. They had formed a part of the division under the command of his sovereign apparent, the Prince of Orange, and as respected length of swords and mustachios, and richness of uniform and equipments, Regulus and his comrades looked to be as gallant a body of men as ever trumpet sounded for. when Ney dashed upon the advance of the allied troops, carrying one position after the other, until the arrival of the great body of the British army from Brussels changed the aspect of the combat of Quatre Bras. The squadrons among which Regulus rode showed the greatest activity in retreating before the French, and were dislodged from one post and another which they occupied, with perfect alacrity on their part. Their movements were only checked by the advance of the British in their rear. Thus forced to halt, the enemy's cavalry, whose bloodthirsty obstinacy cannot be too severely reprehended, had at length an opportunity of coming to close quarters with the brave Belgians before them, who preferred to encounter the British rather than the French, and at once turning tail, rode through the English regiments that were behind them, and scattered in all directions. The regiment, in fact, did not exist any more. It was nowhere. It had no headquarters. Regulus found himself galloping many miles from the field of action, entirely alone. And whither should he fly for refuge so naturally as to that kitchen and those faithful arms in which Pauline had so often welcomed him? At some 10 o'clock, the clinking of a saber might have been heard up the stair of the house where the Osbornes occupied a story in the continental fashion. A knock might have been heard at the kitchen door, and poor Pauline, come back from church, fainted almost with terror as she opened it and saw before her her haggard hussar. He looked as pale as the midnight dragoon who came to disturb Leonora. Pauline would have screamed, but that her cry would have called her masters and discovered her friend. She stifled her scream then, and leading her hero into the kitchen, gave him beer and the choice bits from the dinner, which Jos had not had the heart to taste. The hussar showed he was no ghost by the prodigious quantity of flesh and beer which he devoured, and during the mouthfuls he told his tale of disaster. His regiment had performed prodigies of courage, and had withstood for a while the onset of the whole French army. But they were overwhelmed at last, as was the whole British army by this time. Ney destroyed each regiment as it came up. The Belgians in vain interposed to prevent the butchery of the English. The Brunswickers were routed and had fled. Their duke was killed. It was a general debacle. He sought to drown his sorrow for the defeat in floods of beer. Isidore, who had come into the kitchen, heard the conversation and rushed out to inform his master. "It is all over!" he shrieked to Jos. "My lord Duke is a prisoner. The Duke of Brunswick is killed. The British army is in full flight. There is only one man escaped, and he is in the kitchen now. Come and hear him." So Jos tottered into that apartment where Regulus still sat on the kitchen table, and clung fast to his flagon of beer. In the best French which he could muster, and which was in sooth of a very ungrammatical sort, Jos besought the hussar to tell his tale. The disasters deepened as Regulus spoke. He was the only man of his regiment not slain on the field. He had seen the Duke of Brunswick fall, the black hussars fly, the Écossais pounded down by the cannon. "And the Blanks?" gasped Jos. "Cut in pieces," said the hussar. Upon which Pauline cried out, "Oh, my mistress, ma bonne petite dame!" went fairly into hysterics, and filled the house with her screams. Wild with terror, Mr. Sedley knew not how or where to seek for safety. He rushed from the kitchen back to the sitting-room, and cast an appealing look at Amelia's door, which Mrs. O'Dowd had closed and locked in his face. But he remembered how scornfully the latter had received him, and after pausing and listening for a brief space at the door, he left it, and resolved to go into the street for the first time that day. So, seizing a candle, he looked about for his gold-laced cap, and found it lying in its usual place on a console table, in the ante-room, placed before a mirror at which Jos used to coquet, always giving his side locks a twirl, and his cap the proper cock over his eye, before he went forth to make appearance in public. Such is the force of habit that even in the midst of his terror he began mechanically to twiddle with his hair and arrange the cock of his hat. Then he looked amazed at the pale face in the glass before him, and especially at his mustachios, which had attained a rich growth in the course of near 7 weeks since they had come into the world. "They will mistake me for a military man," thought he, remembering Isidore's warning as to the massacre with which all the defeated British army was threatened. And staggering back to his bedchamber, he began wildly pulling the bell which summoned his valet. Isidore answered that summons. Jos had sunk in a chair. He had torn off his neckcloths and turned down his collars, and was sitting with both his hands lifted to his throat. "Coupez-moi, Isidore!" shouted he. "Vite! Coupez-moi!" Isidore thought for a moment he had gone mad, and that he wished his valet to cut his throat. "Les moustaches!" gasped Jos. "Les moustaches! Coupez! Rassi! Vite!" His French was of this sort, voluble, as we have said, but not remarkable for grammar. Isidore swept off the mustachios in no time with the razor, and heard with inexpressible delight his master's orders that he should fetch a hat and a plain coat. "N'importe plus. Habit militaire. Bonne à vous. Prenez dehors," were Jos's words. The coat and cap were at last his property. This gift being made, Jos selected a plain black coat and waistcoat from his stock, and put on a large white neckcloth and a plain beaver. If he could have got a shovel hat, he would have worn it. As it was, you would have fancied he was a flourishing large parson of the Church of England. "Venez maintenant," he had continued. "Suivez, allez, party dans la rue." And so having said, he plunged swiftly down the stairs of the house and passed into the street. Although Regulus had vowed he was the only man of his regiment, or of the allied army almost, who had escaped being cut to pieces by Ney, it appeared that his statement was incorrect, and that a good number more of the supposed victims had survived the massacre. Many scores of Regulus's comrades had found their way back to Brussels, and all agreeing that they had run away, filled the whole town with an idea of the defeat of the Allies. The arrival of the French was expected hourly. The panic continued, and preparations for flight went on everywhere. "No horses!" thought Jos in terror. He made Isidore inquire of scores of persons whether they had any to lend or sell, and his heart sank within him at the negative answers returned everywhere. Should he take the journey on foot? Even fear could not render that ponderous body so active. Almost all the hotels occupied by the English in Brussels faced the park, and Jos wandered irresolutely about in this quarter, with crowds of other people, oppressed as he was by fear and curiosity. Some families he saw more happy than himself, having discovered a team of horses, and rattling through the streets in retreat. Others again there were whose case was like his own, and who could not, for any bribes or entreaties, procure the necessary means of flight. Amongst these would-be fugitives Jos remarked the Lady Bareacres and her daughter, who sat in their carriage in the porte-cochere of their hotel, all their imperials packed, and the only drawback to whose flight was the same want of motive power which kept Jos stationary. Rebecca Crawley occupied apartments in this hotel, and had before this period had sundry hostile meetings with the ladies of the Bareacres family. My Lady Bareacres cut Mrs. Crawley on the stairs when they met, by chance, and in all places where the latter's name was mentioned, spoke perseveringly ill of her neighbor. The Countess was shocked at the familiarity of General Tufto with the aide-de-camp's wife. The Lady Blanche avoided her as if she had been an infectious disease. Only the Earl himself kept up a sly occasional acquaintance with her, when out of the jurisdiction of his ladies. Rebecca had her revenge now upon these insolent enemies. It became known in the hotel that Captain Crawley's horses had been left behind, and when the panic began, Lady Bareacres condescended to send her maid to the captain's wife with her ladyship's compliments, and a desire to know the price of Mrs. Crawley's horses. Mrs. Crawley returned a note with her compliments, and an intimation that it was not her custom to transact bargains with ladies' maids. This curt reply brought the Earl in person to Becky's apartment, but he could get no more success than the first ambassador. "Send a lady's maid to me!" Mrs. Crawley cried out in great anger. "Why didn't my Lady Bareacres tell me to go and saddle the horses? Is it her ladyship that wants to escape, or her ladyship's femme de chambre?" And this was all the answer that the Earl bore back to his Countess. What will not necessity do? The Countess herself actually came to wait upon Mrs. Crawley on the failure of her second envoy. She entreated her to name her own price. She even offered to invite Becky to Bareacres' house, if the latter would but give her the means of returning to that residence. Mrs. Crawley sneered at her. "I don't want to be waited on by bailiffs in livery," she said. "You will never get back through most probably, at least not you and your diamonds together. The French will have those. They will be here in 2 hours, and I shall be halfway to Ghent by that time. I would not sell you my horses, no, not for the 2 largest diamonds that your ladyship wore at the ball." Lady Bareacres trembled with rage and terror. The diamonds were sewed into her habit, and secreted in my lord's padding and boots. "Woman, the diamonds are at the banker's, and I will have the horses," she said. Rebecca laughed in her face. The infuriate Countess went below, and sat in her carriage. Her maid, her courier, and her husband were sent once more through the town, each to look for cattle, and woe betide those who came last. Her ladyship was resolved on departing the very instant the horses arrived from any quarter, with her husband or without him. Rebecca had the pleasure of seeing her ladyship in the horseless carriage, and keeping her eyes fixed upon her, and bewailing, in the loudest tone of voice, the Countess's perplexities. "Not to be able to get horses," she said, "and to have all those diamonds sewed into the carriage cushions. What a prize it will be for the French when they come. The carriage and the diamonds, I mean, not the lady." She gave this information to the landlord, to the servants, to the guests, and the innumerable stragglers about the courtyard. Lady Bareacres could have shot her from the carriage window. It was while enjoying the humiliation of her enemy that Rebecca caught sight of Jos, who made towards her directly he perceived her. That altered, frightened, fat face told his secret well enough. He too wanted to fly, and was on the lookout for the means of escape. "He shall buy my horses," thought Rebecca, "and I'll ride the mare." Jos walked up to his friend, and put the question for the 100th time during the past hour. Did she know where horses were to be had? "What, you fly?" said Rebecca, with a laugh. "I thought you were the champion of all the ladies, Mr. Sedley." I'm not a military man," gasped he. "And Amelia? Who is to protect that poor little sister of yours?" asked Rebecca. "You surely would not desert her?" "What good can I do her? Suppose the enemy arrive," Jos answered. "They'll spare the women, but my man tells me that they have taken an oath to give no quarter to the men. The dastardly cowards!" "Horrid!" cried Rebecca, enjoying his perplexity. "Besides, I don't want to desert her," cried the brother. "She shan't be deserted. There's a seat for her in my carriage, and one for you, dear Mrs. Crawley, if you will come, and if we can get horses," sighed he. "I have two to sell," the lady said. Jos could have flung himself into her arms at the news. "Get the carriage, Isidore," he cried. "We've found them! We have found them!" "My horses never were in harness," added the lady. "Bullfinch would kick the carriage to pieces if you put him in the traces." "But he is quiet to ride?" asked the civilian. "As quiet as a lamb and as fast as a hare," answered Rebecca. "Do you think he is up to my weight?" Jos said. He was already on his back in imagination, without ever so much as a thought for poor Amelia. What person who loved a horse speculation could resist such a temptation? In reply, Rebecca asked him to come into her room, whither he followed her, quite breathless, to conclude the bargain. Jos seldom spent a half-hour in his life which cost him so much money. Rebecca, measuring the value of the goods which she had for sale by Jos's eagerness to purchase, as well as by the scarcity of the article, put upon her horses a price so prodigious as to make even the civilian draw back. She would sell both or neither, she said resolutely. Rawdon had ordered her not to part with them for a price less than what she specified. Lord Bareacres below would give her the same money, and with all her love and regard for the Sedley family, her dear Mr. Joseph must conceive that poor people must live. Nobody, in a word, could be more affectionate, but more firm about the matter of business. Jos ended by agreeing, as might be supposed of him. The sum he had to give her was so large that he was obliged to ask for time, so large as to be a little fortune for Rebecca, who rapidly calculated that with this sum, and the sale of the residue of Rawdon's effects, and her pension as a widow, should he fall, she would now be absolutely independent of the world, and might look her weeds steadily in the face. Once or twice in the day she certainly had herself thought about flying, but her reason gave her better counsel. "Suppose the French do come," thought Becky. "What can they do to a poor officer's widow? Bah! The times of sacks and sieges are over. We shall be let to go home quietly, or I may live pleasantly abroad with a snug little income." Meanwhile, Jos and Isidore went off to the stables to inspect the newly purchased cattle. Jos bade his man saddle the horses at once. He would ride away that very night, that very hour. And he left the valet busy in getting the horses ready, and went homewards himself to prepare for his departure. It must be secret. He would go to his chamber by the back entrance. He did not care to face Mrs. O'Dowd and Amelia, and own to them that he was about to run. By the time Jos's bargain with Rebecca was completed, and his horses had been visited and examined, it was almost morning once more. But though midnight was long past, there was no rest for the city. The people were up, the lights in the houses flamed, crowds were still about the doors, and the streets were busy. Rumors of various natures went still from mouth to mouth. One report averred that the Prussians had been utterly defeated, another that it was the English who had been attacked and conquered, a third that the latter had held their ground. This last rumor gradually got strength. No Frenchmen had made their appearance. Stragglers had come in from the army, bringing reports more and more favorable. At last an aide-de-camp actually reached Brussels with dispatches for the commandant of the place, who placarded presently through the town an official announcement of the success of the Allies at Quatre Bras, and the entire repulse of the French under Ney after a 6 hours' battle. The aide-de-camp must have arrived some time while Jos and Rebecca were making their bargain together, or the latter was inspecting his purchase. When he reached his own hotel, he found a score of its numerous inhabitants on the threshold discoursing of the news. There was no doubt as to its truth, and he went up to communicate it to the ladies under his charge. He did not think it was necessary to tell them how he had intended to take leave of them, how he had bought horses, and what a price he had paid for them. But success or defeat was a minor matter to them, who had only thought for the safety of those they loved. Amelia, at the news of the victory, became still more agitated even than before. She was for going that moment to the army. She besought her brother with tears to conduct her thither. Her doubts and terrors reached their paroxysm, and the poor girl, who for many hours had been plunged into stupor, raved and ran hither and thither in hysteric insanity. A piteous sight. No man writhing in pain on the hard-fought field 15 miles off, where lay, after their struggles, so many of the brave. No man suffered more keenly than this poor harmless victim of the war. Jos could not bear the sight of her pain. He left his sister in the charge of her stouter female companion, and descended once more to the threshold of the hotel, where everybody still lingered and talked and waited for more news. It grew to be broad daylight as they stood here, and fresh news began to arrive from the war, brought by men who had been actors in the scene. Wagons and long country carts laden with wounded came rolling into the town. Ghastly groans came from within them, and haggard faces looked up sadly from out of the straw. Jos Sedley was looking at one of these carriages with a painful curiosity. The moans of the people within were frightful. The wearied horses could hardly pull the cart. "Stop! Stop!" a feeble voice cried from the straw, and the carriage stopped opposite Mr. Sedley's hotel. "It is George! I know it is!" cried Amelia, rushing in a moment to the balcony, with a pallid face and loose flowing hair. It was not George, however, but it was the next best thing. It was news of him. It was poor Tom Stubble, who had marched out of Brussels so gallantly 24 hours before, bearing the colours of the regiment, which he had defended very gallantly upon the field. A French lancer had speared the young ensign in the leg, who fell, still bravely holding to his flag. At the conclusion of the engagement a place had been found for the poor boy in a cart, and he had been brought back to Brussels. "Mr. Sedley! Mr. Sedley!" cried the boy faintly, and Jos came up almost frightened at the appeal. He had not at first distinguished who it was that called him. Little Tom Stubble held out his hot and feeble hand. "I'm to be taken in here," he said. "Osborne and Dobbin said I was, and you are to give the man 2 Napoleons. My mother will pay you." This young fellow's thoughts, during the long feverish hours passed in the cart, had been wandering to his father's parsonage, which he had quitted only a few months before, and he had sometimes forgotten his pain in that delirium. The hotel was large, and the people kind, and all the inmates of the cart were taken in and placed on various couches. The young ensign was conveyed upstairs to Osborne's quarters. Amelia and the major's wife had rushed down to him when the latter had recognized him from the balcony. You may fancy the feelings of these women when they were told that the day was over, and both their husbands were safe. In what mute rapture Amelia fell on her good friend's neck and embraced her! In what a grateful passion of prayer she fell on her knees and thanked the power which had saved her husband! Our young lady, in her fevered and nervous condition, could have had no more salutary medicine prescribed for her by any physician than that which chance put in her way. She and Mrs. O'Dowd watched incessantly by the wounded lad, whose pains were very severe, and in the duty thus forced upon her, Amelia had not time to brood over her personal anxieties, or to give herself up to her own fears and forebodings after her wont. The young patient told in his simple fashion the events of the day, and the actions of our friends of the gallant Dasht. They had suffered severely. They had lost very many officers and men. The major's horse had been shot under him as the regiment charged, and they all thought that O'Dowd was gone, and that Dobbin had got his majority, until, on their return from the charge to their own ground, the major was discovered seated on Pyramus's carcass, refreshing himself from a case bottle. It was Captain Osborne that cut down the French lancer who had speared the ensign. Amelia turned so pale at the notion that Mrs. O'Dowd stopped the young ensign in this story. And it was Captain Dobbin who, at the end of the day, though wounded himself, took up the lad in his arms and carried him to the surgeon, and thence to the cart which was to bring him back to Brussels. And it was he who promised the driver 2 louis if he would make his way to Mr. Sedley's hotel in the city, and tell Mrs. Captain Osborne that the action was over, and her husband was unhurt and well. "Indeed, but he has a good heart, that William Dobbin," Mrs. O'Dowd said, "though he is always laughing at me." Young Stubble vowed that there was not such another officer in the army, and never ceased his praises of the senior captain, his modesty, his kindness, and his admirable coolness in the field. To these parts of the conversation Amelia lent a very distracted attention. It was only when George was spoken of that she listened, and when he was not mentioned, she thought about him. In tending her patient, and in thinking of the wonderful escapes of the day before, her second day passed away not too slowly with Amelia. There was only one man in the army for her, and as long as he was well, it must be owned that its movements interested her little. All the reports which Jos brought from the streets fell very vaguely on her ears, though they were sufficient to give that timorous gentleman, and many other people then in Brussels, every disquiet. The French had been repulsed, certainly, but it was after a severe and doubtful struggle, and with only a division of the French army. The Emperor with the main body was away at Ligny, where he had utterly annihilated the Prussians, and was now free to bring his whole force to bear upon the Allies. The Duke of Wellington was retreating upon the capital, and a great battle must be fought under its walls probably, of which the chances were more than doubtful. The Duke of Wellington had but 20,000 British troops on whom he could rely, for the Germans were raw militia, the Belgians disaffected, and with this handful his Grace had to resist 150,000 men that had broken into Belgium under Napoleon. Under Napoleon! What warrior was there, however famous and skilful, that could fight at odds with him? Jos thought of all these things and trembled. So did all the rest of Brussels, where people felt that the fight of the day before was but the prelude to the greater combat which was imminent. One of the armies opposed to the Emperor was scattered to the winds already. The few English that could be brought to resist him would perish at their posts, and the conqueror would pass over their bodies into the city. Woe be to those whom he found there! Addresses were prepared. Public functionaries assembled and debated secretly. Apartments were got ready, and tricolored banners and triumphal emblems manufactured to welcome the arrival of His Majesty the Emperor and King. The emigration still continued, and wherever families could find means of departure, they fled. When Jos, on the afternoon of the 17th of June, went to Rebecca's hotel, he found that the great Bareacres carriage had at length rolled away from the porte-cochere. The Earl had procured a pair of horses somehow, in spite of Mrs. Crawley, and was rolling on the road to Ghent. Louis the Desired was getting ready his portmanteau in that city too. It seemed as if misfortune was never tired of worrying into motion that unwieldy exile. Jos felt that the delay of yesterday had been only a respite, and that his dearly bought horses must of a surety be put into requisition. His agonies were very severe all this day. As long as there was an English army between Brussels and Napoleon, there was no need of immediate flight, but he had his horses brought from their distant stables to the stables in the courtyard of the hotel where he lived, so that they might be under his own eyes and beyond the risk of violent abduction. Isidore watched the stable door constantly, and had the horses saddled to be ready for the start. He longed intensely for that event. After the reception of the previous day, Rebecca did not care to come near her dear Amelia. She clipped the bouquet which George had brought her, and gave fresh water to the flowers, and read over the letter which he had sent her. "Poor wretch," she said, twirling round the little bit of paper in her fingers. "How I could crush her with this! And it is for a thing like this that she must break her heart, forsooth! For a man who is stupid, a coxcomb, and who does not care for her. My poor good Rawdon is worth 10 of this creature." And then she fell to thinking what she should do if anything happened to poor good Rawdon. And what a great piece of luck it was that he had left his horses behind. In the course of this day, too, Mrs. Crawley, who saw, not without anger, the Bareacres party drive off, bethought her of the precaution which the Countess had taken, and did a little needlework for her own advantage. She stitched away the major part of her trinkets, bills, and banknotes about her person, and so prepared was ready for any event, to fly if she thought fit, or to stay and welcome the conqueror, were he Englishman or Frenchman. And I am not sure that she did not dream that night of becoming a duchess and Madame le Maréchal, while Rawdon, wrapped in his cloak and making his bivouac under the rain at Mount St. John, was thinking with all the force of his heart about the little wife whom he had left behind him. The next day was a Sunday, and Mrs. Major O'Dowd had the satisfaction of seeing both her patients refreshed in health and spirits by some rest which they had taken during the night. She herself had slept on a great chair in Amelia's room, ready to wait upon her poor friend or the ensign should either need her nursing. When morning came, this robust woman went back to the house where she and her major had their billet, and here performed an elaborate and splendid toilette befitting the day. And it is very possible that whilst alone in that chamber which her husband had inhabited, and where his cap still lay on the pillow and his cane stood in the corner, one prayer at least was sent up to heaven for the welfare of the brave soldier Michael O'Dowd. When she returned, she brought her prayer book with her, and her uncle the Dean's famous book of sermons, out of which she never failed to read every Sabbath, not understanding all, happily, not pronouncing many of the words aright, which were long and abstruse, for the Dean was a learned man and loved long Latin words, but with great gravity, vast emphasis, and with tolerable correctness in the main. "How often has my Mick listened to these sermons," she thought, "and me readin' in the cabin of a calm." She proposed to resume this exercise on the present day, with Amelia and the wounded ensign for a congregation. The same service was read on that day in 20,000 churches at the same hour, and millions of British men and women on their knees implored protection of the Father of all. They did not hear the noise which disturbed our little congregation at Brussels, much louder than that which had interrupted them 2 days previously, as Mrs. O'Dowd was reading the service in her best voice. The cannon of Waterloo began to roar. When Jos heard that dreadful sound, he made up his mind that he would bear this perpetual recurrence of terrors no longer, and would fly at once. He rushed into the sick man's room, where our 3 friends had paused in their prayers, and further interrupted them by a passionate appeal to Amelia. "I can't stand it any more, Emmy," he said. "I won't stand it, and you must come with me. I have bought a horse for you, never mind at what price, and you must dress and come with me, and ride behind Isidore." "God forgive me, Mr. Sedley, but you are no better than a coward," Mrs. O'Dowd said, laying down the book. "I say come, Amelia," the civilian went on. "Never mind what she says. Why are we to stop here and be butchered by the Frenchmen?" "You forget the dash, my boy," said the little Stubble, the wounded hero, from his bed. And you won't leave me, will you, Mrs. O'Dowd?" "No, my dear fellow," said she, going up and kissing the boy. "No harm shall come to you while I stand by. I don't budge till I get the word from Mick. A pretty figure I'd be, wouldn't I, stuck behind that chap on a pillion?" This image caused the young patient to burst out laughing in his bed, and even made Amelia smile. "I don't ask her," Joss shouted out. "I don't ask that Irish woman. But you, Amelia. Once for all, will you come?" "Without my husband, Joseph?" Amelia said, with a look of wonder, and gave her hand to the Major's wife. Joss's patience was exhausted. "Good-bye, then," he said, shaking his fist in a rage, and slamming the door by which he retreated. And this time he really gave his order for march, and mounted in the courtyard. Mrs. O'Dowd heard the clattering hoofs of the horses as they issued from the gate, and looking on, made many scornful remarks on poor Joseph as he rode down the street with Isidore after him in the laced cap. The horses, which had not been exercised for some days, were lively, and sprang about the street. Joss, a clumsy and timid horseman, did not look to advantage in the saddle. "Look at him, Amelia dear, driving into the parlour window. Such a bull in a china shop I never saw." And presently the pair of riders disappeared at a canter down the street, leading in the direction of the Ghent road, Mrs. O'Dowd pursuing them with a fire of sarcasm so long as they were in sight. All that day, from morning until past sunset, the cannon never ceased to roar. It was dark when the cannonading stopped all of a sudden. All of us have read of what occurred during that interval. The tale is in every Englishman's mouth, and you and I, who were children when the great battle was won and lost, are never tired of hearing and recounting the history of that famous action. Its remembrance rankles still in the bosoms of millions of the countrymen of those brave men who lost the day. They pant for an opportunity of revenging that humiliation, and if a contest ending in a victory on their part should ensue, elating them in their turn, and leaving its cursed legacy of hatred and rage behind to us, there is no end to the so-called glory and shame, and to the alternations of successful and unsuccessful murder in which two high-spirited nations might engage. Centuries hence, we Frenchmen and Englishmen might be boasting and killing each other still, carrying out bravely the devil's code of honor. All our friends took their share and fought like men in the great field. All day long, whilst the women were praying 10 miles away, the lines of the dauntless English infantry were receiving and repelling the furious charges of the French horsemen. Guns which were heard at Brussels were ploughing up their ranks, and comrades falling, and the resolute survivors closing in. Towards evening the attack of the French, repeated and resisted so bravely, slackened in its fury. They had other foes besides the British to engage, or were preparing for a final onset. It came at last. The columns of the Imperial Guard marched up the hill of Saint-Jean at length, and at once, to sweep the English from the height which they had maintained all day, and spite of all, unscared by the thunder of the artillery, which hurled death from the English line, the dark rolling column pressed on and up the hill. It seemed almost to crest the eminence, when it began to wave and falter. Then it stopped, still facing the shot. Then at last the English troops rushed from the post from which no enemy had been able to dislodge them, and the guard turned and fled. No more firing was heard at Brussels. The pursuit rolled miles away. Darkness came down on the field and city, and Amelia was praying for George, who was lying on his face, dead, with a bullet through his heart. End of chapter 32.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 33, in which Miss Crawley's relations are very anxious about her. The kind reader must please to remember, while the army is marching from Flanders, and after its heroic actions there is advancing to take the fortifications on the frontiers of France, previous to an occupation of that country, that there are a number of persons living peaceably in England who have to do with the history at present in hand, and must come in for their share of the chronicle. During the time of these battles and dangers, old Miss Crawley was living at Brighton, very moderately moved by the great events that were going on. The great events rendered the newspapers rather interesting, to be sure, and Briggs read out the Gazette, in which Rawdon Crawley's gallantry was mentioned with honour, and his promotion was presently recorded. "What a pity that young man has taken such an irretrievable step in the world," his aunt said. "With his rank and distinction he might have married a brewer's daughter with $250,000, like Miss Grains, or have looked to ally himself with the best families in England. He would have had my money some day or other, or his children would, for I'm not in a hurry to go, Miss Briggs, although you may be in a hurry to be rid of me, and instead of that he is a doomed pauper, with a dancing-girl for a wife." "Will my dear Miss Crawley not cast an eye of compassion upon the heroic soldier whose name is inscribed in the annals of his country's glory?" said Miss Briggs, who was greatly excited by the Waterloo proceedings, and loved speaking romantically when there was an occasion. "Has not the captain, or the colonel as I may now style him, done deeds which make the name of Crawley illustrious?" "Briggs, you are a fool," said Miss Crawley. "Colonel Crawley has dragged the name of Crawley through the mud, Miss Briggs. Marry a drawing-master's daughter, indeed! Marry a dame de compagnie, for she was no better, Briggs, no, she was just what you are, only younger, and a great deal prettier and cleverer. Were you an accomplice of that abandoned wretch, I wonder, of whose vile arts he became a victim, and of whom you used to be such an admirer? Yes, I dare say you were an accomplice, but you will find yourself disappointed in my will, I can tell you, and you will have the goodness to write to Mr. Waxy and say that I desire to see him immediately." Miss Crawley was now in the habit of writing to Mr. Waxy, her solicitor, almost every day in the week, for her arrangements respecting her property were all revoked, and her perplexity was great as to the future disposition of her money. The spinster had, however, rallied considerably, as was proved by the increased vigour and frequency of her sarcasms upon Miss Briggs, all which attacks the poor companion bore with meekness, with cowardice, with a resignation that was half generous and half hypocritical, with the slavish submission, in a word, that women of her disposition and station are compelled to show. Who has not seen how women bully women? What tortures have men to endure, comparable to those daily repeated shafts of scorn and cruelty with which poor women are riddled by the tyrants of their sex? Poor victims! But we are starting from our proposition, which is, that Miss Crawley was always particularly annoying and savage when she was rallying from illness, as they say wounds tingle most when they are about to heal. While thus approaching, as all hoped, to convalescence, Miss Briggs was the only victim admitted into the presence of the invalid, yet Miss Crawley's relatives afar off did not forget their beloved kinswoman, and by a number of tokens, presents, and kind affectionate messages, strove to keep themselves alive in her recollection. In the first place, let us mention her nephew, Rawdon Crawley. A few weeks after the famous fight of Waterloo, and after the Gazette had made known to her the promotion and gallantry of that distinguished officer, the Dieppe packet brought over to Miss Crawley at Brighton a box containing presents and a dutiful letter from the colonel her nephew. In the box were a pair of French epaulettes, a cross of the Legion of Honour, and the hilt of a sword, relics from the field of battle, and the letter described with a good deal of humour how the latter belonged to a commanding officer of the guard, who having sworn that the guard died but never surrendered, was taken prisoner the next minute by a private soldier, who broke the Frenchman's sword with the butt of his musket, when Rawdon made himself master of the shattered weapon. As for the cross and epaulettes, they came from a colonel of French cavalry, who had fallen under the aide-de-camp's arm in the battle, and Rawdon Crawley did not know what better to do with the spoils than to send them to his kindest and most affectionate old friend. Should he continue to write to her from Paris, whether the army was marching? He might be able to give her interesting news from that capital, and of some of Miss Crawley's old friends of the emigration, to whom she had shown so much kindness during their distress. The spinster caused Briggs to write back to the colonel a gracious and complimentary letter, encouraging him to continue his correspondence. His first letter was so excessively lively and amusing that she should look with pleasure for its successors. "Of course I know," she explained to Miss Briggs, "that Rawdon could not write such a good letter any more than you could, my poor Briggs, and that it is that clever little wretch of a Rebecca who dictates every word to him, but that is no reason why my nephew should not amuse me, and so I wish to let him understand that I am in high good humour." I wonder whether she knew that it was not only Becky who wrote the letters, but that Mrs. Rawdon actually took and sent home the trophies, which she bought for a few francs from one of the innumerable pedlars, who immediately began to deal in relics of the war. The novelist, who knows everything, knows this also. Be this, however, as it may, Miss Crawley's gracious reply greatly encouraged our young friends, Rawdon and his lady, who hoped for the best from their aunt's evidently pacified humour, and they took care to entertain her with many delightful letters from Paris, whither, as Rawdon said, they had the good luck luck to go in the track of the conquering army. To the rector's lady, who went off to tend her husband's broken collarbone at the rectory at Queen's Crawley, the spinster's communications were by no means so gracious. Mrs. Bute, that brisk, managing, lively, imperious woman, had committed the most fatal of all errors with regard to her sister-in-law. She had not merely oppressed her and her household, she had bored Mrs. Crawley, and if poor Miss Briggs had been a woman of any spirit, she might have been made happy by the commission which her principal gave her to write a letter to Mrs. Bute Crawley, saying that Miss Crawley's health was greatly improved since Mrs. Bute had left her, and begging the latter on no account to put herself to trouble or quit her family for Miss Crawley's sake. This triumph over a lady who had been very haughty and cruel in her behaviour to Miss Briggs would have rejoiced most women, but the truth is, Briggs was a woman of no spirit at all, and the moment her enemy was discomfited, she began to feel compassion in her favour. How silly I was, Mrs. Bute thought, and with reason, ever to hint that I was coming, as I did, in that foolish letter when we sent Miss Crawley the guinea-fowls. I ought to have gone without a word to the poor dear doting old creature, and taken her out of the hands of that ninny Briggs, and that harpy of a femme de chambre. Oh, Bute, Bute, why did you break your collarbone? Why, indeed? We have seen how Mrs. Bute, having the game in her hands, had really played her cards too well. She had ruled over Miss Crawley's household utterly and completely, to be utterly and completely routed when a favourable opportunity for rebellion came. She and her household, however, considered that she had been the victim of horrible selfishness and treason, and that her sacrifices in Miss Crawley's behalf had met with the most savage ingratitude. Rawdon's promotion, and the honourable mention made of his name in the Gazette, filled this good Christian lady also with alarm. Would his aunt relent toward him, now that he was a lieutenant-colonel and a C.B., and would that odious Rebecca once more get into favour? The rector's wife wrote a sermon for her husband about the vanity of military glory and the prosperity of the wicked, which the worthy parson read in his best voice and without understanding one syllable of it. He had Pitt Crawley for one of his auditors, Pitt, who had come with his two half-sisters to church, which the old baronet could now by no means be brought to frequent. Since the departure of Becky Sharp, that old wretch had given himself up entirely to his bad courses, to the great scandal of the county and the mute horror of his son. The ribbons in Miss Horrocks' cap became more splendid than ever. The polite families fled the hall and its owner in terror. Sir Pitt went about tippling at his tenants' houses, and drank rum and water with the farmers at Mudbury and the neighbouring places on market days. He drove the family coach and four to Southampton with Miss Horrocks inside, and the county people expected every week, as his son did in speechless agony, that his marriage to her would be announced in the provincial paper. It was indeed a rude burden for Mr. Crawley to bear. His eloquence was palsied at the missionary meetings and other religious assemblies in the neighbourhood, where he had been in the habit of presiding, and of speaking for hours, for he felt, when he rose, that the audience said, "That is the son of the old reprobate Sir Pitt, who is very likely drinking at the public-house at this very moment." And once, when he was speaking of the benighted condition of the King of Timbuktu, and the number of his wives who were likewise in darkness, some tipsy miscreant from the crowd asked, "How many is there at Queen's Crawley, young square-toes?" to the surprise of the platform and the ruin of Mrs. Pitt's speech. And the two daughters of the house of Queen's Crawley would have been allowed to run utterly wild, for Pitt swore that no governess should ever enter into his doors again, had not Mr. Crawley, by threatening the old gentleman, forced the latter to send them to school. Meanwhile, as we have said, whatever individual differences there might be between them all, Miss Crawley's dear nephews and nieces were unanimous in loving her and sending her tokens of affection. Thus Mrs. Bute sent guinea-fowls, and some remarkably fine cauliflowers, and a pretty purse or pincushion worked by her darling girls, who begged to keep a little place in the recollection of their dear aunt, while Mr. Pitt sent peaches and grapes and venison from the hall. The Southampton coach used to carry these tokens of affection to Miss Crawley at Brighton. It used sometimes to convey Mr. Pitt thither too, for his differences with Sir Pitt caused Mr. Crawley to absent himself a good deal from home now, and besides, he had an attraction at Brighton in the person of the Lady Jane Sheepshanks, whose engagement to Mr. Crawley has been formally mentioned in this history. Her ladyship and her sisters lived at Brighton with their mamma, the Countess Southdown, that strong-minded woman so favourably known in the serious world. A few words ought to be said regarding her ladyship and her noble family, who are bound by ties of present and future relationship to the house of Crawley. Respecting the chief of the Southdown family, Clement William, 4th Earl of Southdown, little need be told, except that his lordship came into Parliament, as Lord Wolsey, under the auspices of Mr. Wilberforce, and for a time was a credit to his political sponsor, and decidedly a serious young man. But words cannot describe the feelings of his admirable mother when she learned, very shortly after her noble husband's demise, that her son was a member of several worldly clubs, had lost largely at play at Watier's and the Cocoa Tree, that he had raised money on post-obits, had encumbered the family estate, that he drove four-in-hand and patronized the Ring, and that he actually had an opera-box where he entertained the most dangerous bachelor company. His name was only mentioned with groans in the dowager's circle. The Lady Emily was her brother's senior by many years, and took considerable rank in the serious world as author of some of the delightful tracts before mentioned, and of many hymns and spiritual pieces. A mature spinster, and having but faint ideas of marriage, her love for the blacks occupied almost all her feelings. It is to her, I believe, we owe that beautiful poem, "Lead us to some sunny isle, yonder in the western deep, where the skies for ever smile, and the blacks for ever weep," etc. She had correspondences with clerical gentlemen in most of our East and West India possessions, and was secretly attached to the Reverend Silas Hornblower, who was tattooed in the South Sea Islands. As for the Lady Jane, on whom, as it has been said, Mr. Pitt Crawley's affection had been placed, she was gentle, blushing, silent, and timid. In spite of his falling away, she wept for her brother, and was quite ashamed of loving him still. Even yet she used to send him little hurried, smuggled notes, and pop them in the post in private. The one dreadful secret which weighed upon her life was, that she and the old housekeeper had been to pay Southdown a furtive visit at his chambers in the Albany, and found him, oh, the naughty dear abandoned wretch, smoking a cigar with a bottle of curaçao before him. She admired her sister, she adored her mother, she thought Mr. Crawley the most delightful and accomplished of men after Southdown, that fallen angel, and her mamma and sister, who were ladies of the most superior sort, managed everything for her, and regarded her with that amiable pity of which your really superior woman always has such a share to give away. Her mamma ordered her dresses, her books, her bonnets, and her ideas for her. She was made to take pony riding, or piano exercise, or any other sort of bodily medicament, according as my Lady Southdown saw meet, and her ladyship would have kept her daughter in pinafores up to her present age of 26, but that they were thrown off when Lady Jane was presented to Queen Charlotte. When these ladies first came to their house at Brighton, it was to them alone that Mr. Crawley paid his personal visits, contenting himself by leaving a card at his aunt's house, and making a modest inquiry of Mr. Bowles or his assistant footman, with respect to the health of the invalid. When he met Miss Briggs coming home from the library with a cargo of novels under her arm, Mr. Crawley blushed in a manner quite unusual to him, as he stepped forward and shook Miss Crawley's companion by the hand. He introduced Miss Briggs to the lady with whom he happened to be walking, the Lady Jane Sheepshanks, saying, "Lady Jane, permit me to introduce to you my aunt's kindest friend and most affectionate companion, Miss Briggs, whom you know under another title as authoress of the delightful Lyrics of the Heart, of which you are so fond." Lady Jane blushed too as she held out a kind little hand to Miss Briggs, and said something very civil and incoherent about mamma, and proposing to call on Miss Crawley, and being glad to be made known to the friends and relatives of Mr. Crawley, and with soft dove-like eyes saluted Miss Briggs as they separated, while Pitt Crawley treated her to a profound courtly bow, such as he had used to H.H. the Duchess of Pumpernickel when he was attaché at that court. The artful diplomatist and disciple of the Machiavellian Binkie, it was he who had given Lady Jane that copy of poor Briggs's early poems, which he remembered to have seen at Queen's Crawley, with a dedication from the poetess to his father's late wife, and he brought the volume with him to Brighton, reading it in the Southampton coach, and marking it with his own pencil, before he presented it to the gentle Lady Jane. It was he, too, who laid before Lady Southdown the great advantages which might occur from an intimacy between her family and Miss Crawley, advantages both worldly and spiritual, he said, for Miss Crawley was now quite alone, the monstrous dissipation and alliance of his brother Rawdon had estranged her affections from that reprobate young man, the greedy tyranny and avarice of Mrs. Bute Crawley had caused the old lady to revolt against the exorbitant pretensions of that part of the family, and though he himself had held off all his life from cultivating Miss Crawley's friendship, with perhaps an improper pride, he thought now that every becoming means should be taken, both to save her soul from perdition, and to secure her fortune to himself as the head of the house of Crawley. The strong-minded Lady Southdown quite agreed in both proposals of her son-in-law, and was for converting Miss Crawley off-hand. At her own home, both at Southdown and at Trottermore Castle, this tall and awful missionary of the truth rode about the country in her barouche with outriders, launched packets of tracts among the cottagers and tenants, and would order Gaffer Jones to be converted, as she would order Goody Hicks to take a James Powder, without appeal, resistance, or benefit of clergy. My Lord Southdown, her late husband, an epileptic and simple-minded nobleman, was in the habit of approving approving of everything which his Matilda did and thought, so that whatever changes her own belief might undergo, and it accommodated itself to a prodigious variety of opinion, taken from all sorts of doctors among the dissenters, she had not the least scruple in ordering all her tenants and inferiors to follow and believe after her. Thus, whether she received the Reverend Saunders McNitre, the Scotch divine, or the Reverend Luke Waters, the mild Wesleyan, or the Reverend Giles Jowls, the illuminated cobbler, who dubbed himself Reverend as Napoleon crowned himself Emperor, the household, children, tenantry of my Lady Southdown were expected to go down on their knees with her ladyship, and say amen to the prayers of either doctor. During these exercises old Southden, on account of his invalid condition, was allowed to sit in his own room, and have negus and the paper read to him. Lady Jane was the old Earl's favourite daughter, and tended him and loved him sincerely. As for Lady Emily, the authoress of the Washerwoman of Finchley Common, her denunciation of future punishments at this period, for her opinions modified afterward, were so awful that they used to frighten the timid old gentleman her father, and the physicians declared his fits always occurred after one of her ladyship's sermons. "I will certainly call," said Lady Southden then, in reply to the exhortation of her daughter's prétendu, Mr. Pitt Crawley. "Who is Miss Crawley's medical man?" Mr. Crawley mentioned the name of Mr. Creamer. "A most dangerous and ignorant practitioner, my dear Pitt. I have providentially been the means of removing him from several houses, though in one or two instances I did not arrive in time. I could not save poor dear General Glanders, who was dying under the hands of that ignorant man, dying. He rallied a little under the Podgers pills which I administered to him, but alas, it was too late. His death was delightful, however, and his change was only for the better. Creamer, my dear Pitt, must leave your aunt." Pitt expressed his perfect acquiescence. He too had been carried along by the energy of his noble kinswoman and future mother-in-law. He had been made to accept Saunders McNitre, Luke Waters, Giles Jowls, Podgers pills, Rogers pills, Pokey's elixir, every one of her ladyship's remedies, spiritual or temporal. He never left her house without carrying respectfully away with him piles of her quack theology and medicine. Oh, my dear brethren and fellow sojourners in Vanity Fair, which among you does not know and suffer under such benevolent despots? It is in vain you say to them, "Dear madam, I took Podgers' specific at your orders last year, and believe in it. Why am I to recant and accept the Rogers articles now?" There is no help for it. The faithful proselytizer, if she cannot convince by argument, bursts into tears, and the recusant finds himself, at the end of the contest, taking down the bolus and saying, "Well, Rogers be it." "And as for her spiritual state," continued the lady, "that, of course, must be looked to immediately. With Creamer about her, she may go off any day, and in what a condition, my dear Pitt, in what dreadful condition! I will send the Reverend Mr. Irons to her instantly. Jane, write a line to the Reverend Bartholomew Irons, in the third person, and say that I desire the pleasure of his company this evening at tea at 6:30. He is an awakening man. He ought to see Miss Crawley before she rests this night. And Emily, my love, get ready a packet of books for Miss Crawley. Put up A Voice from the Flames, A Trumpet Warning to Jericho, and The Fleshpot's Broken, or The Converted Cannibal. "And the Washerwoman of Finchley Common, mamma," said Lady Emily. "It is as well to begin soothingly at first." "Stop, my dear ladies," said Pitt the diplomatist. "With every deference to the opinion of my beloved and respected Lady Southden, I think it would be quite unadvisable to commence so early upon serious topics with Miss Crawley. Remember her delicate condition, and how very little accustomed she has hitherto been to considerations connected with her immortal welfare." "Can we then begin too early, Pitt?" said Lady Emily, rising with 6 little books already in her hand. "If you begin abruptly, you will frighten her altogether. I know my aunt's worldly nature so well as to be sure that any abrupt attempt at conversion will be the very worst means that can be employed for the welfare of that unfortunate lady. You will only frighten and annoy her. She will very likely fling the books away, and refuse all acquaintance with the givers." "You are as worldly as Miss Crawley, Pitt," said Lady Emily, tossing out of the room, her books in her hand. "And I need not tell you, my dear Lady Southden," Pitt continued in a low voice, and without heeding the interruption, "how fatal a little want of gentleness and caution may be to any hopes which we may entertain with regard to the worldly possessions of my aunt. Remember, she has 70,000 pounds. Think of her age, and her highly nervous and delicate condition. I know that she has destroyed the will which was made in my brother's, Colonel Crawley's, favour. It is by soothing that wounded spirit that we must lead it into the right path, and not by frightening it. And so I think you will agree with me that—" "Of course, Lady Southden remarked. Jane, my love, you need not send that note to Mr. Irons. If her health is such that discussions fatigue her, we will wait her amendment. I will call upon Miss Crawley to-morrow." "And if I might suggest, my sweet lady," Pitt said in a bland tone, "it would be as well not to take our precious Emily, who is too enthusiastic, but rather that you should be accompanied by our sweet and dear Lady Jane." "Most certainly Emily would ruin everything," Lady Southton said, and this time agreed to forego her usual practice, which was, as we have said, before she bore down personally upon any individual whom she proposed to subjugate, to fire in a quantity of tracts upon the menaced party, as a charge of the French was always preceded by a furious cannonade. Lady Southdown, we say, for the sake of the invalid's health, or for the sake of her soul's ultimate welfare, or for the sake of her money, agreed to temporize. The next day the great Southdown female family carriage, with its earl's coronet and the lozenge, upon which the 3 lambs trotted argent upon the field vert of the Southdowns, were quartered with sable on a bend oar, 3 snuff-mull's gules, the cognizance of the house of Binkie, drove up in state to Miss Crawley's door, and the tall serious footman handed in to Mr. Bowles her ladyship's cards for Miss Crawley, and one likewise for Miss Briggs. By way of compromise, Lady Emily sent in a packet in the evening for the latter lady, containing copies of The Washerwoman, and other mild and favourable tracts for Miss B.'s own perusal, and a few for the servants' hall, viz., Crumbs from the Pantry, The Frying Pan and the Fire, and The Livery of Sin, of a much stronger kind. End of chapter 33.